The brutal truths you'd learn if you survived just one winter in the Dark Ages. Hey friends, tonight let's drift back in time, farther than your grandmother's stories, farther than electricity, engines, or even glass windows. We're going to visit a winter, but not just any winter. A winter that clung to your bones, crept into your dreams, and stayed for months without mercy. Outside, the wind isn't howling, it's breathing, slow and steady, like something old and watching. Inside, the world is darker than you expect. Not pitch black, just tired. The candle's flame dances, but barely. Its light is warm, but not brave. The walls are made of timber, cracked and drafty. The roof is thatch, and the cold slips in quietly, like it belongs. You're lying on straw, worn, flattened, dusted with dirt and ash. Your blanket? Shared. With your brother, your sister, maybe even a goat. The fire's out, the wood is gone, and your breath rises like smoke, but disappears before it can finish its sentence. This was winter in the Middle Ages. Not the kind on postcards, not the kind with mugs of hot cocoa and freshly baked bread. This was the kind that made people disappear. Over the next 2 hours, we won't rush. We'll wander slowly, through the cold, through the quiet, through the forgotten lives of those who knew winter not as a season, but as a test. 1. The cold that hated you. It didn't start with snow. It started with stillness. A quiet that settled into the bones of the village. Long before the first flake touched the earth. Long before the sky turned heavy with that pale, silent gray. The animals knew first. They always did. The hens stopped laying. The dogs grew restless. The cows breathed slow and deep. And then, one morning, the air didn't move. Not a breeze. Not a bird. Just frost climbing the windowless walls. And silence so complete, it hummed. You didn't need a calendar. You felt it in your knuckles. In the way the wood split too easily. In the ache that settled in your jaw when you chewed cold bread. You woke up colder than you went to sleep. And every morning began with the same question. How bad will it be today? Because the cold didn't just arrive. It descended, like a second skin you couldn't peel off. Like a presence, unseen, but always there. It wasn't cruel with speed. It was cruel with patience. It waited for you to grow tired. It waited for your firewood to run out. It waited for you to stop pretending it would pass quickly. There were no coats, no puffer jackets, no synthetic linings. Just wool, scratched and mended, layered until it itched more than it warmed. Your boots weren't waterproof. They were barely shoes. Your feet went from numb to hurting to silent. That's when you knew the cold had won that round. The elders had stories, always stories. They said in the worst winters, the rivers didn't just freeze, they cracked. And if you listened closely at night, you could hear the sound of the frost splitting the earth like dry bones. Some said it was God's judgment. Others said it was the devil dancing in the trees, but most didn't say anything at all. They just huddled closer to the fire, closed their eyes, and hoped they'd open them again tomorrow. And yet, it wasn't the temperature that broke people. It was the sound it erased. No laughter, no song, no footsteps in the snow, because no one was walking. Just the creak of timber, and your own heartbeat echoing in your ears. You learned to fear that silence, because it meant everyone else was just trying not to die. And then, there was the cold that came from inside. From hunger, from grief, from knowing you couldn't help your child warm their hands, because yours were colder. That's the cold that hated you. Not just your body, but your hope. It didn't want to kill you fast. It wanted you to believe it never would. And then take you slowly, while you waited for a sun that never rose. And yet, some survived. They laughed even. Not because it was funny, but because there was nothing else to do. They beat the cold with songs made up on the spot, with dances by candlelight, with stories whispered in the dark. Stories like the one we're telling now. So, if you're still here, still listening, and still breathing warm air from your modern bed, let's keep going, because cold was only the beginning. Next came the question of how to stay warm, in a world where warmth wasn't free. Coming up next, 2. How they tried and failed to stay warm. But for now, just breathe, and let the frost settle. We're not done yet. 2. How they tried and failed to stay warm. They tried. Of course they tried. You don't just lie down and let the cold take you. Not at first. Not when there's still a sliver of firewood, a scrap of wool, a bit of hope. They started with the hearth, the center of the home, the only source of heat. It wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, and most nights, it wasn't enough. They'd stack what they had: twigs, straw, dried dung if they could find it. Whatever would burn without choking them to death with smoke. The fire didn't roar. It whimpered. It licked the stones, and flickered as if deciding whether to keep trying. They'd sit around it in silence, children closest, mothers behind them, fathers at the edge, animals just outside the ring, noses steaming in the cold air. Sometimes, they didn't speak for hours. They just listened to the crackle, like a heartbeat too faint to trust. When the firewood ran out, and it always did, they turned to the walls. Old beams, abandoned carts, even furniture passed down from grandfathers long dead. It was all just wood now, and survival doesn't care about sentiment. Next came the layering. Wool on wool. Shirts never washed because the dirt helped insulate. Scraps of leather, old curtains, even straw stuffed between tunics and skin. They wrapped their feet in rags, slept in hats, and pulled their sleeves down so far their fingers forgot how to move. But wool isn't magic. It slows the cold. It doesn't stop it. They shared body heat, not out of affection, out of necessity. Whole families slept in one bed, if they had one. If not, on the floor. Stacked like logs, arms around strangers, legs tangled with siblings. Even livestock were welcomed in, because the warmth of a goat was better than the pride of being clean. There were tricks. Some would heat stones in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and tuck them beneath blankets. Others slept with pots of warm water, until they cracked from the cold. Some chewed garlic, some drank vinegar, not for flavor, but because someone once said it helped. And in a world like that, any idea was worth trying. But the cold always found a way in, through gaps in the doorframe, through boots worn thin, through lungs that stopped steaming. And every night, someone somewhere asked the same quiet question. Is it always this hard? Some made it through by stubbornness, some by luck, and some didn't. A child fell asleep too far from the fire. A grandmother gave her blanket to the baby. A father stayed up to watch the embers, and never woke again. And still, they tried, because trying was all they had. No electric heat, no thermostat, no blanket delivery truck, just fingers, fire, and faith. Faith that tomorrow might be warmer. Faith that spring wasn't a lie. And when the fire burned out, they told stories in the dark. Stories of summers past, of sun-warmed stones and green fields, of apples so red they looked painted. They remembered warmth, because sometimes memory burns brighter than flame. And as the wind pressed harder against the walls, as frost crept in along the floorboards, they didn't fight it. They just pulled each other closer. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't beat the cold. You outlasted it. And not everyone did, but that was just one battle. Because even if you managed to stay warm, you still had to eat. And in winter, food wasn't just scarce. It was cruel. Sheetbeds were a luxury, sleep was survival. You didn't go to bed in the Middle Ages. You crawled toward rest, grateful, exhausted, and unsure if you'd wake again. Beds weren't things you owned. They were things you shared. And not just with family. With fleas, with mice, with the aching wood beneath you, and with the cold that never really left. Most didn't have a bed frame. The poor slept on the floor, on straw mostly. Sometimes mixed with old rags, leaves, or, if you were lucky, a wool blanket that hadn't been patched to death. It wasn't soft. It wasn't warm. But it was where you laid your body when the day stopped asking for it. And the day always asked for everything. There were no mattresses, no pillows fluffed with feathers, no privacy curtains tied with lace. Just corners. Dark corners. with people curled in them like folded laundry, stacked together like books no one finished reading. Sleep wasn't peaceful. It was an escape, a flicker of warmth stolen from the fire you could no longer feed. A window into dreams that were often warmer than the room you left behind. You didn't stretch, you curled, tight like a root in dry soil. And even then, sleep wasn't guaranteed. Not when the wind howled, not when the roof dripped, not when your child coughed through the night beside you, and certainly not when hunger made your stomach speak louder than your thoughts. There were nights when the cold was so sharp it felt like glass inside your chest, and you woke. Not because you were rested, but because your teeth were chattering too loud to ignore. They slept in shifts sometimes, one by the fire, one tending animals, one watching the door. Not out of fear of thieves, but because wild dogs followed the smell of death when the cold grew long. And yet even in this, there was tenderness. A mother brushing straw from her child's hair. A brother covering his sister's feet when he thought she was already asleep. A husband whispering a joke into the dark just to hear his wife laugh before they drifted off. Because even when comfort was gone, companionship remained. Some families named their sleeping spots. Not beds, just areas of the floor or hay they used over and over. Warm side. Good corner. Underbeam. Names passed down like heirlooms. Because in a world without much, you cherished where you survived. And when the firelight finally faded, when the last whisper was swallowed by quiet, sleep took them all. Not gently, not quickly, but deeply. The kind of sleep that comes only when the body is tired of being afraid. Sometimes they dreamed of sun, of meals that filled the belly, of blankets heavy enough to mean something. And then morning came, or didn't. But those who woke, they rose together, blinking against the cold, stretching sore limbs, shaking the frost from their hair, and beginning again. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't wake up refreshed. You woke up grateful. And if the cold and the floor and the hunger didn't take you in the night, there was still one question waiting for you when you opened your eyes. What will we eat today? Because comfort was a dream, but food was a fight. Coming up next, 4. The Frozen Hunger Games. For now, lie still. Let your blanket pull closer, and imagine the sound of 1,000 stomachs, groaning in the dawn. 4. The Frozen Hunger Games. The cold was cruel, but the hunger? The hunger was personal. It didn't whisper like the wind. It growled, it clawed, it sat in your belly like a stone that never softened. And it didn't leave when you went to sleep. It followed you into your dreams. They called it the lean season, but lean was a polite word, a word for scribes and monks. Out here, in the fields long buried beneath snow, it was starvation. The harvests were gone. Whatever was left in the root cellar, if you had one, was shriveled, bruised, or already half-eaten. The apples had long since rotted, the grains had been ground into dust, and the salted meats, once saved for emergencies, well, this was the emergency. Bread became a luxury, but not the kind you know. No crusty golden loaf, no buttered slice. This bread was dark, hard, rough, baked with old flour, bark powder, and sometimes even dirt to stretch it farther. They called it famine bread. Not to be poetic, just to be accurate. The rich had food, the church had food, but for the peasant, each bite was earned. By digging, begging, or sometimes stealing. They boiled whatever they could find. Cabbage stems, turnip leaves, bones already picked clean. Boiled again and again and again until the water smelled like meat, but never tasted like it. Mothers fed children first. Fathers chewed slowly so the little ones wouldn't see how small their portion was. And the elderly often claimed they weren't hungry, even when they hadn't eaten in 2 days. Because survival wasn't fair, it was triage. Some resorted to desperation. Old records speak of dogs disappearing, of rats caught in traps and skinned by candlelight, of leather boots boiled to softness and chewed like jerky. There are stories, rare but real, of darker meals, when famine lasted long enough to erase the line between grief and hunger. We don't linger there, but we don't look away either, because it happened, and it mattered. Still, they hoped. They grew clever, hungrier, but smarter. They learned which roots to dig under frozen earth, which weeds could be mashed into paste, which dried herbs could turn hot water into a soup almost worth remembering. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, a traveler came through, with bread, with wine, with stories from towns where food was still real. And for one night the hunger paused, not because it left, but because hope was enough to fill them for a while. Children would go to bed whispering about cakes, not because they'd ever tasted one, but because they'd heard about them from someone, who heard it from someone, who maybe saw one once at a wedding. And in those stories the hunger softened, just a little. But morning always came, and with it, the rumble returned. The question returned. The cold bowl, the empty ladle, the aching silence. Hunger didn't just take food. It took laughter, it took strength, it took time. Because the more you felt it, the slower you moved, the less you worked, the more the cold crept in. It was a cycle, a cruel loop. And once you were in it, there weren't many ways out, except one. And it slept beside you every night. But we'll talk about that soon. Because first, you need to understand what it was like for the children. The smallest ones. The ones who didn't know why their stomach hurt, only that it always did. Coming up next, 5. Children didn't cry, they endured. But for now, take a deep breath. Imagine the taste of dry bread, the sound of an empty pot, and the silence of a family, eating nothing, together. 5. Children didn't cry, they endured. You might think the children cried, but they didn't. Not because they weren't hurting, not because they weren't scared, but because crying takes energy, and energy was something they couldn't spare. In winter, childhood froze with everything else. There were no games in the snow, no bright mittens or snow angels or laughter in white fields. Just work, and cold, and silence. They were small, but useful, sent to gather wood scraps, to carry water from the frozen well, to sit by the pot and stir, even when there was nothing in it but boiling water and hope. They learned not to ask, not because they didn't have questions, but because they'd seen the answers on their parents' faces. Answers like, "We don't know if there'll be dinner. We're out of candles. We're just trying to make it to spring." They shared blankets, shared chores, shared fear, and in that shared silence they grew old faster than they should. Their toys weren't toys. A carved stick became a sword. Not for fun, but to chase away rats. A round stone was a ball, until it cracked a tooth. A doll, sewn from scrap cloth, wasn't for play, but for praying over. Because when your sister is sick, and the fire's gone cold, and you're 5 years old, you cling to whatever you think might listen. There were no bedtime stories, only the sound of coughing, of someone breathing too fast, or not at all. And yet, they adapted. Like little shadows, they learned where to step without making noise, where to stand to feel a sliver of warmth, when to speak, when to vanish. They played sometimes, quietly, gently, with the snow maybe, or with each other's hair, or just with time. They'd draw circles in the frost with their fingers, breathe on the window pane and make shapes, pretend that the snowflakes falling were stars coming closer. They found wonder, not in toys but in survival. If a visitor gave them bread, they didn't eat it all. They wrapped a piece for their mother. They saved a crumb for later. They held it in their hands like it was gold, because it was. To them it always was. Sometimes they smiled. And that smile, in a room full of quiet pain, was a kind of rebellion, a refusal to disappear completely. And when one of them didn't wake up, the others didn't scream. They sat, still, small, older than they were, and waited. Because the world didn't stop. Not for grief, not for children. But children didn't stop either. They kept going, one foot, then the next. One chore, then another. One breath, then another. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't get to be a child. You got to be alive if you were lucky. And most days that was more than enough. But even in their silence, In their tired little bodies and quiet eyes, they held on to something. Something precious. Joy. Not the loud kind, not the bright dancing kind, but a small ember deep inside that said, "I'm still here." And maybe, just maybe, that ember was stronger than the fire itself. But while they endured, so did the others. The older ones, the tired ones, the ones who still remembered what summer felt like. And many of them found refuge, not in food or fire, but in something older, something sacred. 6. Laughter in the dark. It wasn't loud. Not the kind of laughter that fills a room. Not the laughter of parties or songs or toasts raised high. It was quieter, more delicate. A sound you almost didn't trust, because it felt too warm to belong in such a cold place. But it was real. Some nights, after the fire had faded to embers, after the last chore had been done, after the last bowl had been licked clean, someone would say something. Not much, just a comment, a silly sound, a line from an old tale, and someone else would smirk, then giggle, then try to hide it under a blanket, but fail. And soon, just for a moment, the whole room forgot how hungry it was. Laughter didn't need heat, it was heat. A flicker of light in a room made of shadows. They didn't laugh to ignore the pain. They laughed to push it back, to remind it who they were, to say, "You may freeze my bones, but you don't get my spirit." The jokes weren't clever, they weren't rehearsed. Most were about pigs that ran away, neighbors who talked to geese, uncles who couldn't find their boots for 3 days, because they'd been wearing them the whole time. Silly things, ordinary things, beautiful things, and sometimes the laughter came from the children, pretending their potatoes were royalty, making faces with coal smudges, tickling each other beneath straw blankets until someone snorted so loudly the chickens squawked. The old ones laughed too. They remembered better winters, or worse ones. They told stories of frost so thick they could sculpt it into little angels, of a goat that learned to open doors, of the time grandfather fell asleep in the barn and woke up buried in hay, with a chicken sitting on his chest like a king on a throne. These weren't distractions. They were medicine, because when you laugh, even just once, your body remembers what it means to be human. Not just surviving, but feeling. Some monks believed laughter was divine, a crack in the sorrow of the world, a brief rebellion against despair. Maybe they were right. Because in that tiny room, with its dirt floor and smoke-stained rafters and patched-together lives, a joke could feel like salvation. And the best part? Laughter echoed. It didn't matter that the walls were thin, that the wind moaned, that someone had just buried their grandmother the day before. When laughter found a home, it stayed a while, warmed the air, softened the silence, tucked itself under the covers and said, "I'm not leaving tonight." And for a few minutes you could close your eyes, with a smile on your face, even if your stomach was empty, even if your fingers were numb, because laughter filled you in ways no soup ever could. And when it faded, when the room returned to quiet, and the last chuckle drifted off like smoke, what remained wasn't sadness, it was softness, the kind that reminds you, you're not alone in the dark. But outside those thin walls, something else waited. Not the cold, not the hunger, something older, something deeper. The long, dark season of waiting, waiting for warmth, for spring, for life to start again. And not everyone made it. Coming up next, 7, not everyone survived the waiting. But for now, let the last echoes of laughter drift. Let your eyes close slowly, and remember, even in the darkest nights, someone, somewhere, was still smiling. 7, not everyone survived the waiting. They didn't talk about it, not out loud. Loss wasn't announced, it was noticed. A spot by the fire that stayed empty. A bowl that went unfilled. A name that no one said at supper. Sometimes they were old. A grandfather who'd given too much of his coat to his grandson. A grandmother who whispered a prayer, then simply went still. It was quiet, dignified, almost kind. Other times, they were young. A baby who never learned to shiver. A child who stopped asking for breakfast. A boy who laid down near the fire and never opened his eyes again. There was no screaming, No sirens, no clocks stopped, just silence, heavier than snow. Death in winter came like frost, slow, creeping, inevitable. It started with forgetting words, then names, then the days of the week, then how to move your fingers, then how to care. And by the time your breath no longer steamed in the air, you were already somewhere else. They buried them when they could, sometimes in the frozen earth, sometimes wrapped in cloth, placed beneath barns, or laid gently in the forest. Markers were rare, time was short, grief was a luxury, but remembrance was everywhere. A scarf no one wore anymore, a lullaby no one finished, a seat beside the hearth that no one dared to take. People didn't cry much, not because they didn't feel, but because crying in the cold just made your face hurt. So they carried grief differently, in the way they stirred the pot, in how they looked at the sky, in the way they said, maybe next year, but never said whose name they were thinking of. Some lit candles, some carved little symbols in wood, a feather, a tree, a circle. Each meant something, even if they couldn't explain it, and some just waited longer than the body could. Because when someone you love doesn't wake up, part of you stays in the dark with them. But still, the village moved on, because it had to. Chores didn't pause. Animals still needed feeding, fires still needed tending, and little brothers still needed holding. Because life didn't stop for death. It never had. And yet, each time they lost someone, they lost a little more warmth, a little more noise, a little more hope. But spring was always somewhere. They just didn't know if they'd live to see it. And so they waited, not for joy, not even for warmth, just for something different, something that wasn't this. Sometimes that waiting felt like faith, other times, like punishment. But always it was heavy and quiet, like standing in a field of snow listening for footsteps you're not sure are coming. But even in that stillness, they held on. To what? That's the question. And the answer is in the next breath, the next chore, the next flicker of warmth. Not in the fire, but in the soul. Coming up next, 8. The soul needed fire too. But for now, close your eyes. Let the snow fall soft in your memory. And if someone doesn't show up in the story again, it's not because they were forgotten. It's because in the Middle Ages, even memory had to choose what it could carry. 8. The soul needed fire too. The fire kept you alive, but not just the one in the hearth. There was another fire, one you couldn't feed with twigs, one you couldn't see or touch. But if it ever went out, you'd know. It lived in the chest, behind the ribs, beneath the breath. It burned low on hard days, flickered in the silence. But it was there, always. They never talked about it, not directly, but you could feel it. In the way they looked at the horizon, in the way they lit the last candle, in the way they sang when no one asked them to. Because when you live in darkness, you make your own light. Some found it in prayer. Hands clasped tight, knees on frozen stone, whispers curling into the rafters like steam. They didn't beg for miracles, just mercy. Just enough strength to carry the bucket one more time, to stand without shaking, to keep the baby from crying. Others found it in song, old melodies, no instruments, just breath and memory, the kind of songs that had no beginning, that seemed older than language, that rose in the throat like warmth you'd forgotten you had. And some found it in hope, hope for spring, hope for letters from the capital, hope that the cow might give milk again, hope that someone, somewhere was walking toward them with something to share. That fire inside? It didn't burn fast, it burned slow, like a candle left behind in a cold room, like the last ember in the ashes, waiting to be noticed. But it mattered, because once the soul froze, everything else followed. So they tended it, quietly, daily, like a secret, like a ritual. They told stories of saints who survived plagues, of warriors who came home, of kings who once walked the same muddy paths, not because the stories were true, but because they felt true. They carved prayers into wood, hung charms over doors, wore bits of bone or metal on string, not for magic, but for meaning. And meaning, in the Middle Ages, was sometimes the only thing between breath and nothing. Even children knew it. They whispered wishes into the fire, buried treasures in the earth, held hands in silence when someone was sick, because they felt the flame. Even if they didn't have the words for it yet, the soul needed fire. A reason, a rhythm, a reason not to lie down in the snow and stop trying. And sometimes, that reason wasn't big, it wasn't noble. It was a pig that still needed feeding, a sister who wanted to learn a song, a single bean sprouting in the dark because somehow it still believed in the sun. And when spring finally came, when the ice retreated and the ground cracked open like a secret being told, they didn't cheer. They just nodded, as if to say, I kept it burning. But not everyone did. And that's what made it holy. Because fire, real or imagined, doesn't care how you found it. Only that you did. Coming up next, 9, spring didn't mean safety. Spring didn't arrive like a celebration. It arrived like a whisper, a slow drip, a shift in the wind, a bird call. That sounded too early to be true. The snow melted in patches like a wound healing unevenly. Mud replaced silence. Water ran where it hadn't in months. People stepped outside, not with joy, but with caution, because winter had left its mark. On the land, on the body, on the soul. And spring didn't clean it away. The bodies had to be buried. The animals had to be found. The roofs had to be patched where the ice had chewed holes. And food? Food didn't just appear because flowers did. There were no crops yet. The root cellars were empty. The cows were thin. The chickens, fewer than before. And the first green shoots? They weren't for celebration. They were for survival. Dandelions, nettles, wild onions, things you'd pass by in summer, now gathered with reverence, boiled like treasure, shared like gold. And sickness followed the thaw, water that ran through graves, mold in the damp corners, infections that waited for warmth to bloom, coughs that didn't stop, fevers that came too late to blame on winter, mouths that bled without reason, children who stumbled in the sun because their legs forgot how to carry them. And yet, they worked. Because spring didn't wait. The fields had to be plowed. The seeds had to be sown. The tools had to be repaired or rebuilt from splinters and wire. The men limped. The women leaned. The children dragged sacks twice their weight. Because hunger didn't die in the cold. It hid in the thaw. They prayed for dry weather, then for rain, then for anything that wasn't too much of anything. Because one storm could ruin it all, again. Some had lost so much in winter that spring felt cruel. The sun reminded them of those who weren't there to see it. The warmth made the empty beds feel colder. The birdsong felt like a joke told too soon. And yet, they kept moving, planting, hoping, bending over rows of soil with backs too tired to straighten. Because spring was not the reward. Spring was the test. It asked, did you learn anything from the cold? Did your soul's fire survive? Can you begin again with less than you had before? And the answer was always the same. We have to. Not because they were strong, but because they were needed. The village didn't run on hope. It ran on effort, on muscle memory, on stubbornness passed down like bread recipes and lullabies. So they planted not just seeds, but willingness. Not just crops, but faith. They planted into earth that had swallowed so many. And in that act, they said, we're still here. But staying was never guaranteed. Because there were other things waiting beyond the edge of the village. Not snow, not wind. Something older. Something that didn't care what season it was. Coming up next, 10. War was always close. But for now, rest your hands on the edge of the memory. Smell the turned soil. Hear the creak of a wooden yoke. And know that spring didn't save them. It simply let them begin again. 10. War was always close. It didn't need banners, or horns, or horse hooves pounding the hills. War came quietly. Sometimes it began with a messenger, dust on his cloak, eyes too wide, voice too low. A name you didn't recognize, a place you'd never heard of, and a king's decree. Other times, you didn't hear about the war until you heard it. Boots in the mud, metal against wood. Screams not your own, but close enough to feel like they might be. Villages like this one were never the prize. They were the path, the shortcut, the place to rest, the place to take what was needed. And when men with swords needed food or shelter or quiet, they didn't ask. They took. Sometimes they were your countrymen. Sometimes they wore strange colors. Sometimes they didn't wear colors at all. Just leather, rust, blood already dried on the hilt. And when they came, you didn't fight. You hid. You sent the children to the woods. You scattered livestock to confuse the count. You buried silver in the garden. You hoped they'd leave quickly. But war never leaves quickly. It lingers, in the form of burned roofs, broken gates, wells gone sour, and fields trampled under boot and hooves. Even when the soldiers were gone, they left pieces of themselves. A cracked helmet, a rusted blade, a grave no one marked, because no one wanted to remember who it belonged to. The village would return to work, but never quite the same, because every face carried one more shadow, every wall had one more hole, every silence, one more reason to listen harder. And yet, somehow life still returned. They fixed what they could, stitched what was torn, shared what was left, and kept going. Because war didn't ask if you were ready. It just asked if you were standing. Some boys didn't come back. Some fathers never left. Some daughters learned to swing an axe for more than wood. Even stories changed. Children once told tales of wolves. Now, they told tales of men. Men with no names, no kindness, and no reason. But not all stories ended in ruin. Some ended in rescue, in neighbors who stood guard, in strangers who shared bread, in a soldier who looked into a cottage window and walked away. Because even war, in rare trembling moments, remembered it once had a heart. Still, the fear never left. They didn't build castles, but they did learn to listen, to know the difference between wind and warning, between hooves and thunder, between silence and something that wanted to break it. And so they lived, not peacefully, but watchfully, planting with one hand and holding the other close to the door. Because peace wasn't a season. It was a pause, a breath, a moment before the next reason to run. And even in those rare years, those quiet springs and gentle summers, they never stopped glancing toward the edge of the woods. Because out there, past the trees, beyond the river, war was always close. But war wasn't the only shadow. Another enemy grew not from swords, but from within. From the aches that didn't go away. From the fever that crept in during warm nights. From the coughing that began in one house and ended in 10 funerals. 11. Sickness wore no armor. You didn't see it coming. It didn't ride a horse, didn't wave a flag, didn't shout orders across a frozen field. Sickness just appeared. One cough, then two, then a silence too heavy to ignore. At first, they thought it was just the cold. Just the long winter leaving its fingerprints. Just the dust from the barns. Just tired lungs. From tired days. But then came the fever. The kind that burned hot even in the snow. The kind that made skin slick, eyes glassy, tongues dry as straw. And then the shaking. Like something deep inside the body wanted to crawl out. And then the silence. Not the peaceful kind. The other kind. They didn't understand the names. Didn't have the words for plague or flu or contagion. They just knew what followed. One house would close its shutters. Then another. Then the paths between doors went unused. Then the church bells rang too often. Then they stopped ringing altogether. Some believed it was punishment. Others, a curse. Some said it came in the breath. Others, on the wind, in the eyes of strangers, on coins, on the wool of rats. But no matter where it came from, it stayed. Mothers nursed children who wouldn't wake. Fathers dug graves they would never visit twice. Children sat by bedsides long after the bodies had cooled. And still, the sickness lingered, unseen, unstoppable. They tried everything. Herbs burned in bowls, salt circles on doorsteps, smoke puffed through the rafters, ashes rubbed on skin. Some even stayed in barns with the animals, thinking distance might save them. It didn't, because sickness didn't care. It didn't check your age, or wealth, or whether you prayed every morning, or not at all. It just moved, from hand to hand, from breath to breath, and when it passed, if it passed, it left behind more than emptiness. It left fear. Of each other, of touch, of the next cough. There were no hospitals, no doctors, only guesses, no medicine, only hope. And when hope failed, you had to be ready. Some people didn't die, but they didn't live the same. Their walk changed, their breath changed. Their sleep was never deep again, because once sickness visited your home, it never truly left. Even if your body healed, your mind remembered. The smell of sweat and vinegar, the bowl of broth that stayed full, the sound of your sister whispering things that didn't make sense anymore. But somehow, they went on. Not because they forgot, but because forgetting would mean losing what little was left. So they remembered, with candles, with songs, with the simple act of keeping a name alive. And when the sun rose again, as it always eventually did, they stepped outside. Not stronger, not wiser, just still breathing. And sometimes that was enough. But even as the fever faded, another season waited. Not winter, not war, not sickness, but celebration. The strange, gentle season where life felt too beautiful to trust. 12 Joy wasn't easy either. It should have been simple. The sun came back. The fields turned green. The babies stopped crying. The cows gave milk again. The flowers returned to the windowsills. The bells rang for weddings, not funerals. But something held them back. Joy didn't arrive like a flood. It arrived like a stranger, knocking softly, and no one knew whether to open the door. Because after everything, the frost, the fire, the blood, the silence, Joy felt suspicious. Smiles didn't come easily. Laughter sounded too loud. Dancing felt like blasphemy. And yet, Joy knocked again. At first, it came in small things. A child chasing a butterfly. A loaf that rose just right. A new calf, standing wobbly but alive. Then in music. Not grand, not perfect. Just a fiddle, out of tune. Played at the edge of the field while someone stirred stew. Then in stories, told by the fire again. Not stories of sickness or snow, but foolish ones. About talking chickens, drunk goats, and the boy who kissed the wrong bride. And slowly, they laughed again. Not because the pain was gone, but because they were still here. That was the trick. Joy didn't erase the grief. It grew beside it. They danced again, awkward at first, feet unsure, hands too stiff, hearts too guarded. But they danced. In the dust, in the meadows, in the kitchens barefoot, while bread baked and windows were open again. And when someone smiled, really smiled, people noticed. Because it had been so long since a face lit up without apology. Joy was not a celebration, it was a decision. To let the world back in. To look at color without flinching. To eat a full meal without imagining who wasn't at the table. It wasn't easy. Sometimes it hurt. Because joy reminded them of what they almost lost. And who they actually did. But they let it in, not all at once. In breaths, in songs, in sunlight filtering through thatched rooftops onto new babies, new names, new beginnings. They hung herbs over doors again, but not for protection, for beauty. They wore color again. They sang louder. They dared to plan. For tomorrow, for harvest, for the next year. They were still cautious, but no longer afraid of living. And that was its own kind of miracle. Because to feel joy after sorrow isn't forgetting. It's remembering what joy costs, and choosing to pay it anyway. So when the harvest came, and they raised their mugs and danced in circles, they didn't do it because the pain was gone. They did it because they were still able to dance, and that was sacred. But not all dances happen in light. Some are whispered. Some are worn like scars. Some only come when the day is done, and no one is watching. And some are passed down. 13, the stories they left behind. They didn't call themselves brave. They didn't think of themselves as survivors, or warriors, or legends. They were just people. But people leave echoes. And the quietest lives sometimes leave the loudest ones. Not in books, not on monuments, but in whispers, in customs, in the way bread is baked, in the way lullabies are sung with a certain pause at the end of the verse. The way they did it. They told stories, by firelight, with hands moving more than lips, with long pauses, because memory needed time. Some of those stories were about saints, some about wolves, Some about women who outwitted death with nothing but a spoon and a prayer. Most were about no one in particular. Just a cold day, a lost sheep, a stew that nearly burned, and the laugh that saved it. But within those simple stories was everything. Grit, kindness, fear, and that mysterious, stubborn little flame that never quite went out. Children listened. Not always well, not always quietly, but something stayed. In the way they held a mug in winter, in how they layered their clothes, in how they always saved the last piece of bread for someone who might be late. The stories became habits, the habits became culture, the culture became us. Because make no mistake, we are the children of those cold winters, of those flickering fires, of those who made joy out of scraps and hope out of ashes. We don't carry their names, but we carry their instincts. The way we lean toward warmth, the way we look out the window when the wind howls, the way we pause when the power goes out, and wonder if it's coming back. That's not just survival, that's memory, woven into the body. So when we light a candle, or make soup from almost nothing, or sit quietly while the snow falls, we're telling their stories again. Without words, without trying, we remember. Even when we don't know what we're remembering. And that's why they mattered. Not because they won anything, but because they endured. And in enduring, they passed something on. A rhythm, a recipe, a way of waiting without despair. That's the legacy. Not armor, not gold, but a spirit that knows when the cold comes again, we will survive it too. 14. The things they never wrote down. They didn't write it down. Not because it wasn't important, not because it wasn't real, but because it didn't need ink to survive. It was stitched into their hands. It was folded into the dough, tucked between the beams of the attic, sung in half melodies over the pot of stew that never quite boiled. You see, for the medieval peasant, writing was something done by other people. People in towers, people behind monastery gates, people who didn't spend every waking hour chasing warmth, food, or the sun. There was parchment, yes, but it was sacred, expensive, scarce, used for prayers, laws, kings, never for things like how to tell if the baby's fever was too high, or what it meant when the cow wouldn't drink, or why you should never plant beans on the second moon after frost. That knowledge lived elsewhere, not in books, but in breath, passed from lips to ears, from calloused fingers to trembling ones. Like a story you had to live through to believe. They didn't write it down, but they knew. That the wind told stories if you listened to its direction. That mushrooms with skirts could feed a family, or kill one, depending on the way they grew after rain. That your shadow at noon told you more than any church bell. None of this was printed, but it was known. Deeply, collectively, lovingly. And above all, quietly. They didn't need to shout their knowledge. They lived it. And because they lived it, they passed it on through the rhythm of life. Rhythm like the way your grandmother smacked the bottom of the loaf before declaring it ready. The pattern of your father's steps, 4 slow, 3 quick, as he paced the fence line when a storm approached. The exact beat your sister tapped on the table when she was trying not to cry, but the grief was leaking out through her fingertips. They didn't write it down, but it was everywhere. In the stains on the apron, in the cracks of the wooden spoon, in the worn spot on the floor where your uncle knelt every night, without fail, to pray. There were no journals, only gestures. A hand brushed 3 times over the child's forehead before bed. A single candle blown out, but never pinched. A piece of bread left at the windowsill for no one in particular, and everyone. You might have asked, why do we do this? And the answer would be a shrug, or a look, or a quiet, because it's always been done that way. That answer wasn't laziness, it was reverence. Because in the village, habit was memory, and memory was sacred. There were old women who never read a word, but could cure a cough, set a bone, and predict the rain just by the color of the morning frost. There were men who didn't know Latin, but could tell you the best day to harvest flax, and exactly how many paces to walk before digging a new well. They carried libraries in their bodies, and when they died, it was as if someone had closed a book and thrown away the only key. So the young ones listened. Not always, not well, but enough. Enough to know that grief smells like thyme in boiling water. That shame tastes like too much salt in the bread. That love sounds like silence, but the kind that lets you breathe easier, not tighter. They didn't write it down, but you could feel it in the way they hung the laundry. Whites first, darkest in the back, never on the Lord's Day. And always, always, clipped upside down, so the ghost wouldn't see your face. No one told you that. But if you clipped it wrong, an old hand would appear beside yours, correcting it without a word. There were rules for the cellar, rules for the attic, rules for the table. Not written, but understood. You didn't sit in your grandfather's seat. You didn't slice the bread from the bottom. You didn't eat the last spoonful if someone else was still holding theirs. And when tragedy came, as it often did, you didn't talk about it. You picked up the broom. You stoked the fire. You folded the sheets. You laid the cloth over the mirror. That was how you said goodbye. That was how you remembered. That was how you survived. They didn't need ink. They had firelight and sorrow, and hands that knew more than mouths ever could. When a woman miscarried, no one wrote her name on a scroll, but someone left warm bread by her door. When a man lost his crop, no one recorded his loss in the parish ledger, but 5 neighbors showed up with buckets and a silent glance that meant, "We'll fix it together." There was no need to write it down, because it lived, in action, in presence, in love that didn't need permission. And when a child was old enough to ask questions, they were told stories. Not fairy tales, but real ones. Of the time their father bled from the hand but finished the fence. Of the night their mother stood outside in the snow, waiting for the moon to rise just right so the seeds would take root. Stories weren't just entertainment, they were survival. And survival never needed a bookmark. Just memory and time. There was a woman once. She lived at the edge of the village, in a house with a blue door and a crooked chimney that smoked even in June. She never taught a class, never gave a speech, but every child knew. When her lantern stayed lit past midnight, something had gone wrong in someone's home, and she would know what to do. She didn't write it down. She didn't need to, because the village didn't ask for explanations. It asked for presence. When a child had fever, they came to her door. When a lamb wouldn't stand, her fingers found the right place beneath its ribs. She never spoke more than necessary. But if you watched her hands, you'd see a language older than words. They called her wise. But it wasn't wisdom, not the way books describe it. It was memory, earned, not taught, lived, not read. And when she died, people didn't weep loudly. They just stood in the field outside her home, waiting for the wind to shift, as if it might carry some part of her back one last time. That was how it was. People carried pieces of each other, not in photos, not in signatures, but in movements, and smells, and quiet choices. Like the way your aunt picks rosemary, because it reminds her of the bread your grandmother made, or the way your uncle won't whistle after dark. Not because he's superstitious, but because once, when he did, the dog never came back. These fragments of living were the village's pages, scattered, unbound, but remembered. And just as memory lived in people, it lived in the land. The village wasn't just timber and stone, it was a map of memory. That bend in the road, that's where Thomas fell from his horse and laughed before he bled. That patch of herbs, planted by a girl who never married but taught half the village to walk. That wall near the river, built by hands that are all bones now, but still hold the weight of every stone. No signs, no plaques, but stories soaked the soil. And every step you took meant something, if you knew how to read the ground. Even grief had its own grammar. There were no formal eulogies. But when a man died, his boots were left by the door until the rain washed the dust from them. When a woman passed, her last batch of soap was buried under the tree where she used to sing. The children didn't always understand, but they felt it. And one day, when their hands repeated the motion without knowing why, they would understand more than words ever could. And then came change. It always does. Someone married from another village, brought new ways, new tools, new ideas. At first it was good, easier, cleaner, but slowly some things stopped. No more kneeling to touch the ground before planting. No more hush around the hearth when the first frost came. No more stories about the house that listens when you cry. And something went missing. Not all at once, but in pieces. A child no longer knew why the comb was kept in the drawer with the bread knife. A man stopped leaving water by the door for wandering souls. Not because he didn't care, but because he never learned. You can't remember what was never given to you. The elders tried. They told stories, repeated gestures, left space for silence. But the world got louder, faster, hungrier for proof. And memory is quiet. It doesn't shout, doesn't argue, it waits. And sometimes it leaves, but not entirely. Some things stick. You light a candle on stormy nights, though the electricity's fine. You stir soup clockwise. You touch the door frame twice when you leave. You don't know why, but you do, because someone, somewhere, once did it for you. Not because they were taught, but because they remembered. And so here you are, sitting with this story, in a time of screens and speed, wondering why a tale of peasants and silence feels like coming home. It's because you're not far from them. Not really. Their stories aren't locked in the past. They're in you. In your hands, your breath, your instinct to knock on wood. Because even now, the way you hold your child when they cough at night, the way you pause before walking into a room that feels wrong, the way you leave the last bite of bread for someone else, those are things no one taught you, but someone once knew. And now, so do you. Because they didn't write it down, but you remembered anyway. 15, the fire was sacred. It began before you opened your eyes. Even before your mother's arms, before the weight of cloth or the taste of milk. The first thing you knew was fire. Not fire as in burning, not destruction, not fear, but warmth. The kind that hummed against your skin when the world outside was nothing but dark frost and distant wolves. In the medieval village, fire was not just a tool. It was a presence, a pulse, a member of the household who never spoke but always listened. You didn't think about it. You simply knew. Where the fire lived, you could live too. Children were taught early. You greet the fire each morning. You don't take from it until you've thanked it with breath. You don't leave it alone at night. Ever. Because the fire remembers. It remembers kindness and care and silence. If you slammed the pot too hard, it sputtered. If you whispered gently, it flared. If you wept near it, sometimes, it leaned in. Crackled softly as if it understood. These weren't superstitions, they were relationships. Because when the snow thickened and the bread ran thin and the coughs wouldn't stop, you didn't pray to saints first. You prayed to the flame. It was the first thing lit in a new home, and the last thing extinguished when someone died. Some families kept embers for decades, passed them from hearth to hearth in covered pots, wrapped in moss and ash. That ember had cooked every meal. Seen every birth, heard every argument. It knew more than any priest. And if it ever went out, there were rules. You didn't just relight it from any fire. No, you borrowed a flame from a neighbor. Carefully, respectfully. Wrapped in cloth, protected in a hollowed horn, you brought it home. Heart pounding, as if carrying a soul. And in a way you were, because fire meant more than heat. It meant continuity. To lose your fire was not just inconvenience. It was shame. It meant you hadn't cared for it, hadn't watched closely enough, hadn't kept the rhythm. And the rhythm was everything. 1 log before dusk, 2 after nightfall. Ash raked gently, not hard. Coals turned with a stick, never metal. Children learned this before they could speak in full sentences. They were handed small twigs, taught to blow, not too hard, until the coal woke up again with its sleepy orange glow. And if a spark jumped out, you didn't shout. You coaxed it back. You taught it the border, with breath, with presence, with trust. The hearth was the heart. Not metaphorically, literally. It sat at the center of the home. Not just for convenience, but for gravity. It pulled life toward it. Meals were born there, so were legends. While the stew bubbled, voices softened. Hands stopped working. Eyes turned distant. And stories began. Stories about the fire that never died. The one that burned under the castle for 300 years, or the flame that whispered secrets. Only to the old midwife who kept it fed with herbs no one could name. Children half believed these tales. Adults pretended not to. But no one disrespected the fire. Even animals understood. Cats curled closest to the warmest stones. Dogs placed their noses inches from the ash and exhaled like monks in prayer. And on coldest nights, families moved closer. Not just for warmth, but for assurance that the world, though brutal and frozen, still allowed a circle of orange and gold in which laughter and love could survive. No one talked much on those nights. You didn't need to. The fire spoke enough. It told you, you are alive. You are not alone. You are still here. And you believed it, because the fire had seen you at your worst, your coldest, your most afraid, and never turned away. The flame didn't ask you to earn its light. It simply gave it. Night after night, meal after meal, tear after tear. It forgave, it welcomed, it waited, until the last log burned down, until the last pot was cleaned, until even the shadows fell asleep. And then, it glowed in silence. Fire didn't just warm bodies, it warmed memory. And when someone passed, you didn't just cry, you fed the fire. You laid oak on the hearth. Oak, not pine. Because pine crackled too loud. And this was a time for silence. You stirred the coals with your left hand. Left, not right. Because right was for beginnings. And this was not a beginning. The house stayed dim that night. Only the fire remained lit. And people came. Not to speak, not to eat, but to sit beside the flame and let its breath remind them of the one who no longer breathed. Sometimes a slipper was placed near the hearth, not to dry, but to remember. Sometimes a bundle of herbs was tossed on the flame, to scent the air, to carry a goodbye upward. The fire was the bridge, between what was and what would never be again. Children watched from corners, eyes wide, ears tuned to the silence between footsteps. They learned grief not through sermons, but through flame. The way it dimmed, then sparked, then settled. Like the ache in a chest that doesn't leave, but learns how to sit quietly. And then days later, the fire was cleaned. Carefully, reverently. Not to erase, but to make space. A new log, a fresh flame, a slow, steady breath. And in that moment, life began again. Fire taught them resilience. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that keeps glowing even when no one's looking. The kind that returns after every storm, every famine, every cruel, silent winter. Fire was the village's oldest friend. It never left. It never betrayed. It never judged. It simply asked, "Will you keep me alive?" And they did. Through war, through hunger, through doubt. They carried sparks in leather satchels, buried coals under ash for transport, blew embers back to life with cracked lips and fading hope. Because as long as the fire burned, so did the story. You see, a village could rebuild walls, regrow fields, replace tools, but if the fire died, utterly, something deeper was lost. When a hearth stayed cold for more than 3 nights, the neighbors came. Not with matches, but with bread and soup and presents. They brought laughter, just enough to wake the spark. And if the new flame caught, they sat with it, telling stories of old times until the shadows relaxed their grip. Even when people didn't believe in saints, they believed in the fire, because it saw things no one else saw. The whispered prayers of a tired mother, the trembling hands of a boy confessing failure, the quiet smile of an old man eating alone. Fire never told secrets, but it kept them. And in return, people gave it offerings. Not grand ones, but simple. A curl of onion skin, a pinch of salt, a murmured word like thank you or please. Even weddings had fire. Not always large, not always planned, but someone would bring a candle. Someone would light a taper from the hearth and carry it into the night, so the couple would never begin cold. And babies? The first breath wasn't enough. There had to be warmth. They were wrapped and brought near the fire, not too close. Just enough for the light to kiss their skin. Just enough for them to know. This world is harsh, but it is not without mercy. It's strange to think now of houses without fire, of buttons clicked and metal coils glowing without soul. No scent of ash, no dance of flame, no crackle to fill the silence between thoughts. We have warmth, but we've lost the ritual of tending, and tending was everything. It taught patience, discipline, listening. You couldn't rush a fire, you couldn't ignore it. You had to sit and stay and stir and wait. In a way, fire was the first meditation. It taught children stillness. The good kind. The kind that comes not from fear, but from respect. You could tell a house's soul by how its fire was kept. Too wild, chaos. Too dim, neglect. Too loud, anger. But just right, and it meant peace. And when someone tended the fire with steady hands and a soft smile, you knew their life had depth. Not riches, not ease, but depth. That was the mark of the old villagers. Not that they survived, but how. With reverence, with rhythm, with fire. So if tonight you light a candle, pause, breathe, watch it dance. It remembers more than you do. Because once upon a time, someone with your face, your blood, your hope, tended a flame in the dark. Not for light, not for show, but for survival. And the fire kept them, as it keeps you now. 16. The secret's in the soil. Before there were altars, before there were laws, before there were even words for God, there was soil. And the peasants knew it, not as farmers know it today, through pH and yield charts, but through feeling, through silence, through the way their feet sank after rain. To them, the earth was not a resource, it was a relative, a memory keeper, a giver, but also a witness. They called her many names. Some whispered. Some only sung when no one else could hear. But she was always her. The soil, the one who took the seed and gave bread, took the dead and gave spring, took your shame, quietly, and buried it beneath root and rock and time. There were rules, not written ones, but ancient. You did not spit on soil. You did not curse while sowing. You did not enter the field with blood on your hands, because the earth remembers. It wasn't fear exactly, it was reverence. The same kind you feel when walking into a room where someone has just cried. A knowing that this space holds something fragile. The village had no scientists, but they knew which soil crumbled sweetly, which soil turned bitter, which would sing wheat up from the ground, and which would bury your efforts like a secret. They read the land like you read a face. Cracks told of thirst. Ant trails told of coming storms. Moss whispered of cold. And when the earth refused to yield, they didn't blame her. They asked her why. Some knelt, some wept, some left offerings. Not grand ones. A crust of bread, a ribbon of cloth, a handful of ash from last winter's fire. Because the earth understood grief. She held the bones of babies who never cried, and of mothers who never screamed, and of fathers who never returned. All of it, beneath your feet. When you stood in the field, you stood on history, on prayers, on punishment, on forgiveness. You stood on stories too heavy to be told aloud. No one needed to say this. You just felt it in the way your grandmother pressed the shovel with both hands and paused before turning the first spring soil. There was a rhythm. Spring for sowing, summer for growth, autumn for taking, winter for mourning, and then again. But not every year. Some years, the earth said no, and it said it without words. With rot, with drought, with wind that scattered seed like warning. And in those years, you learned that you do not own the soil, you borrow it from your children, from the ones before, from the ones not yet here. That's why the plow was never passed lightly. It was a ceremony, a trembling, like holding a book written in breath. Even weeds were watched with curiosity. Dandelion meant change. Thistle meant stubbornness. Clover meant the earth forgave you, at least for now. They said that earthworms were letters. Tiny messages from the deep telling you the ground still breathed. If you found none, you lit a candle that night and watched. Soil was not static. It changed. Darkened in grief. Lightened in celebration. Cracked in punishment. Swelled in promise. And the people changed with it. They knew when to let a field rest. Not because of rotation charts, but because of instinct. The kind that lived in the soles of their feet. Children were taught to touch the ground, not just step on it. Palm flat, pressure soft. And listen, not with ears, but with attention. A warm patch meant hidden growth. A cold one meant the dead hadn't finished speaking. You don't have to believe it, but they did. And that belief shaped everything. From how they stored grain, to how they walked through graveyards, to how they argued. Yes, argued. You didn't shout near fields. You didn't cry where barley had just been sown, because emotions sunk into the ground, and came back up later, in strange ways. A twisted stalk, a bitter root, a harvest that rotted too fast. Some said it was nonsense, but those who forgot the earth's temperament usually found themselves hungry. The soil was not just where they grew things, it was where they hid things. A tooth from a child's first lost smile. A splinter from the door where a father had knocked before leaving. A lock of hair, braided with grief. They didn't bury valuables. They buried moments, because they believed the ground kept better than any chest or shelf. It didn't warp, didn't burn, didn't lie. It held your pain, without judgment. And sometimes, it even softened it. There was a place beyond the last row of wheat. A patch of grass no one planted, no one cut. Children called it the listening ground. If you were quiet enough, if you pressed your ear to it, you could hear the murmurs. Not words, but rhythms, like a memory breathing beneath the roots. Of course, no one talked about it aloud. Not at church, not at table, but everyone knew. Some things were too sacred for speech. Old women said that worms carried gossip, not the cruel kind, but the kind that warned you. This soil is watching. This corner remembers something you forgot. Before planting season, villagers walked the perimeter of their fields, not just to measure, to feel. They stopped at certain stones, laid a hand, whispered names of those who once harvested here, or those who never returned from winter. Then they'd bend, fingers pressed into black dirt, and ask softly, "Are you ready again?" Sometimes the answer was no. How would they know? A dream, a rust-colored patch, a bird that landed on the wrong branch. That was the language of the land. It didn't scream, it hinted, and the wise ones listened. There was a boy once, Mathis, thin, pale, silent. He planted early, too early. The old ones warned him. He shrugged. "Sky's blue," he said, "ground soft." But not all softness is readiness. His barley grew fast, faster than expected. Then it twisted, like a body dancing with pain. The stalks bent backward. The grains turned sour. No one ate it, not even the pigs. And when Mathis stood at the edge of the ruined field, his mouth tight, his jaw still, the village didn't say, "I told you so." They simply stood beside him and watched the wind carry the lesson. From that year on, he waited. He walked the stones, he touched the soil, and he whispered. Because the soil didn't just grow food, it grew humility. Sometimes, secrets rose from it. Old tools, a bone with a carved letter, a rusted brooch in the shape of a bird no one could name. Each time the village paused, not to claim, to remember. Who buried this? What were they afraid of? What story did the ground keep that we'd forgotten? They never kept what they found. Each artifact went to the altar of the old tree, a hollow place near its roots, lined with moss and stone. They didn't worship the tree, but they trusted it. Because trees, like soil, do not lie. The oldest among them claimed that the earth had moods. It sulked after harsh words. It sang after forgiveness. It wept after injustice. And when enough sorrow sank into the fields, they turned red for a season. The crops grew bitter. The animals birthed early, and the wind whistled at night. No one dared to ignore these signs. Because what's below always rises. Not always in the way you expect. Not as ghosts or curses, but as echo, in the root that refuses to pull. In the well that tastes strange. In the breath that catches when you pass a certain corner of the barn. They didn't fear the earth, but they respected its memory. And memory to them was holy. When someone died, they didn't just mark the grave. They waited for the ground to settle, for the moss to grow, for the first wildflower to bloom there. Only then did they speak the name aloud again, because the earth, they believed, had to process grief too. It had to absorb what had been lost, turn it, warm it, fold it into the folds of loam and silence. That's why their footsteps were soft, not just from poverty, but from reverence. Each step a prayer, each field a chapel, each furrow a psalm. They didn't teach this in words. They showed it with pauses. with the way they touched a leaf before plucking, with how they looked at the ground after rain, as if it had whispered something too beautiful to repeat. And then came the change. New tools, new boots, new thoughts. People stopped whispering, stopped waiting, started digging fast, burning weeds, turning soil like it owed them something. And the ground responded, not with fire, not with thunder, but with silence. The birds sang less, the roots clung tighter, the vegetables grew bigger but tasted less. It wasn't anger, it was grief, because the soil had been a friend, a keeper, a confidant, and now it was a commodity. But not all was lost, because somewhere, a girl still touches moss with her pinky before entering the garden. A boy still buries a note in a jar beneath the rose bush his grandmother planted. A woman still pauses when the wind shifts, just long enough to wonder, what is the ground trying to say? These things remain, because the secrets in the soil were never really secrets. They were songs, and songs always find their way back. If you listen, if you kneel, if you let your hands grow dirty again, then maybe, just maybe, the earth will whisper once more, and you'll remember what your ancestors never forgot. 17, the sound of work. Before the rooster, before the sun even dared to roll over the horizon, there were already sounds. Not loud ones, not sharp or sudden, but the small, steady ones, like breath, like memory, like survival. The shuffle of wool-wrapped feet on cold wooden floors, the creak of joints that had worked too many seasons, the soft clatter of tin against stone as someone found the water jug, and then silence again. Not emptiness, but pause. The kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from waiting, waiting for the day to begin its demands. The sound of work was not a song, not in the way we think of music. It was more like a hum, low, continuous, ancient. You might call it background noise. They called it life. Every tool had its voice. The broom, a scratchy whisper across flagstone floors. The ladle, a gentle knock as it struck the side of the pot with each stir. The firewood, a dry crackle, not only from the flames, but from the splitting hours before, when the axe had argued with the log, and the log had lost. Outside it was colder, always colder. Your breath came out before you. It looked surprised to be alive, and even in that freezing stillness, the barn door groaned open. A wheelbarrow squeaked under the weight of wet hay. A goat bleated, irritated at being woken. Someone muttered a prayer or a curse. It was hard to tell the difference at that hour. There were no alarms, no clocks, no office bells. Time was measured by muscle, by what had been done, and by what hadn't. And in that rhythm, there was order. Not the kind written in ink, but the kind worn into the soles of your feet. The baker didn't wait for light. Flour doesn't care about the moon. He kneaded in silence, each push of the palm echoing into the cold air. The bread would rise, or it wouldn't. But either way, the motion came first. The blacksmith's shop wasn't always hot. In winter it was cold enough to bite. He'd blow into his hands, rub them on his apron, and strike the first hammer against anvil with a force that startled the crows into silence. A shepherd walked past the hedgerow, boots wet from melted frost. He counted sheep, not to sleep, but to live, because losing even one meant less wool, less cheese, less hope. The women woke just as early, not by choice, but by tradition. Their work didn't clang or ring. It rustled, it simmered, it hummed under the breath. The cradle's soft rock, the spin of thread between fingers, the layered, careful folding of cloth. Even sorrow was handled in silence. There was a reverence to how they worked, not because they loved it, not always, but because they understood that work was the answer to every question they didn't have time to ask. The children watched it all, wide-eyed, silent, not out of fear, but because there was so much to learn from the way an adult shifted their weight when lifting a pail of water, or how they squinted to thread a needle by firelight. Nothing was wasted, not effort, not sound. A spilled grain of barley was picked up. A cracked bowl was patched with sap and string, and its reappearance at the next meal was a quiet triumph. Even arguments had rhythm. They flared and faded between chores. A shout between rows of carrots. A sigh while hanging laundry. A sharp word passed across a firewood pile like a hot coal that burned no one, but left a mark anyway. And yet most days were too full for fighting. Because the thatch had to be laid, the nettles picked, the stew stirred just so, or the bitterness would ruin it all. They didn't need songs to pass the time. Work was its own tempo, a lullaby with no words, a sermon without a preacher, a march with no war. You could close your eyes and tell who was working nearby just by the sounds. Thomas with his off-rhythm axe strokes, one strong, one soft, always uneven. Marin, whose spinning wheel never stopped once it started. A circle of dedication too perfect for anyone else to mimic. Little Bruna humming nonsense to the chickens as she scattered feed like blessing. And when someone was missing, you felt it in the air, in the absence of their rhythm. The silence left behind was not empty. It was a question. The worst days were the quiet ones. Not peaceful quiet, but broken. Like when illness kept a mother in bed, and no one stirred the stew, and the floor stayed dusty, and everyone moved too slowly, as if fearing the noise would shatter her completely. But even then, the village worked, because grief doesn't cancel hunger, and tears don't chop wood. So they folded mourning into motion, wore black while planting, wept while washing, breathed heavy over hot fires until the sobs cooled, because to stop was to risk forgetting how to start again. So they moved, always, every day, even the old ones, especially the old ones, because their hands remembered things the young hadn't yet learned. A sharper way to hold the sickle, a slower pace for walking the ridge, a better knot for binding a bundle of kindling. Their knowledge wasn't in books, it was in motion, in the way they moved through the world. And when they finally stopped, really stopped, the silence was so loud you could hear the fire hesitate. You don't need a grave to remember someone. Sometimes all it takes is the sound of a handle worn smooth by 3 lifetimes of hands. The way it knocks gently when leaned against the doorway. The way it doesn't fall, because it knows its place. In villages where ink was rare and parchment rarer, history was stored in motion. Preserved not on pages, but in the pauses between labor. Work was their memory, and every movement, the turn of a wheel, the twist of a rope, the split of firewood, was a sentence passed down, not in words, but in gestures. Fathers taught sons to tie knots not by instruction, but by repetition. Like this, he'd say, not explaining, just showing. His hands would move, and the boys would follow. Not because he understood, but because he believed. Mothers taught daughters to mend linen the same way, not with patterns, but with feeling. This stitch holds sadness, one might whisper, pointing at a darker thread sewn into a baby's sleeve. It was the winter we buried your brother. So the fabric became a family tree, each repair a story, each fold a prayer. They didn't keep photo albums. They kept aprons, patched, stained, stitched with the evidence of meals made, tears wiped, and lives endured. The silence that came at the end of work wasn't restlessness. It was reverence. After the firewood was stacked, after the grain was milled, after the boots were dried by the hearth, they sat, not to talk, but to be still. And in that stillness they heard the ghosts. Not haunting, just present. The sound of grandmother's cough echoing faintly in the chimney. The slow clink of grandfather's spoon against the same tin bowl you now held in your lap. Sometimes, the past whispered through muscle. Your body moved before your brain did. Folding blankets the way your mother had, even though she'd never taught you. But she had, with her hands every morning for years. And your eyes had learned the choreography. Legacy wasn't passed down. It was absorbed. Like steam from a pot. Like the smell of ash in a wool coat. Like a melody you don't remember learning, but hum anyway when no one's listening. Even their laughter followed the same paths. You could tell who a child belonged to by the way they chuckled at spilled flour, or snorted while chasing geese. The sense of humor, even that, was shaped by the rhythm of their house's work. Some families had a way of sighing after a long day that sounded exactly like their roof settling in the cold. Others had a habit of tapping their fingers while waiting for stew, a beat identical to the creak of their front step. The work shaped them, but more strangely, they shaped the work. Every task, over time, developed its own identity, no longer just milling wheat or plucking feathers. It became something sacred, a ritual, a ceremony, a quiet resistance against the void, because the world beyond their walls, it didn't care. The kings, the wars, the maps drawn by far-off hands, none of that noticed the mother in the corner, coaxing life back into her sick child with honey and cloth. But she worked anyway. She hummed. She folded. She whispered stories not written anywhere but in the curve of her spine as she bent over the bed. And maybe that's why the work endured. Not because it had to, but because it gave them a reason to keep going when hope was too expensive to afford. The old tools outlived the hands that held them, but they never forgot. The handle of a shovel would carry the imprint of grief from the day it was used to dig a grave. The tongs in the fire pit knew the smell of celebration, from the night they turned meat on the eve of a wedding. And when someone picked up that same tool years later, they'd pause. They'd feel the weight, the warmth, the memory. Not everyone could explain it, but everyone knew it. That's why tools were passed down in silence. Not as gifts, not with speeches, but with a nod, a gesture, a lingering grip before letting go. Because to inherit a tool was to inherit the responsibility of its rhythm. You couldn't just use it, you had to honor it, by moving like they moved, by working like they worked, by breathing in sync with the heartbeat it remembered. And some tools, they didn't get passed down. Some were buried, with the person who had shaped them so perfectly that it felt wrong for anyone else to try. A blacksmith's hammer worn down to a nub. A mother's spindle, still holding the thread she never finished. A farmer's hatchet, wrapped in the same cloth that once lined his cradle. These were buried not out of practicality but love, because some legacies can't be divided. They must be kept whole, even in the ground. The church bells marked the hours, but the real passage of time, it was in the sounds of work. The way a pot boiled faster in summer. The way a door swelled in the wet seasons and creaked in protest. The way the same broom swept the same floor 1,000 times, and still never made it clean enough for grief to leave. And when the children finally grew, and had children of their own, they didn't need instruction. They remembered. The sound of their father coughing into his sleeve as he loaded the cart at dawn. The flick of their mother's wrist as she tasted the stew and shook her head. Not yet. The way their sister hummed when braiding her hair, but only on cold mornings. These details lived in them, and when their hands reached for the same tools, the ghosts reached back. Not to haunt, but to steady. You don't need history books to know who you are. Sometimes you just need to hold the same axe, strike the same wood, and listen. Listen to the echo that says, "You were here before. You will be here again." Keep moving. 18. The things they feared at night. Day was for work. Night was for wondering if you'd live to see the next one. Because in the Middle Ages, when the last ember gave up, when the oil in the lamp hissed out its final breath, and the darkness settled like a lid on the world, that's when the true silence arrived. And in that silence, everything you thought you knew shifted. The thatch above your head groaned like a sleeping animal. The wind clawed at the shutters like fingers that had learned to open things. And no matter how hard you tried to convince yourself that it was just a tree creaking, just a dog whimpering in its sleep, just a memory of a sound, your body remembered something older than logic. It remembered fear. Not fear of taxes or the Lord's soldiers, or even famine, but the kind of fear that prickles your skin before your mind even has time to name it. The fear that lives in marrow, in myth, in moonless spaces, because in the dark, things returned. Things no one dared describe aloud. The villagers had names for them, but they didn't always speak them. They'd mutter charms, hang bits of iron by the door, draw crosses in ash on the window frame, anything to keep the night things out. But what were they? That was the problem. No one really knew, and that's what made them worse. Some said it was the spirits of the damned, wandering the fields in search of warmth. Others believed it was the souls of unbaptized babies, whimpering through the fog, begging to be let in. Some feared witches, not the kind with pointed hats, but quiet, bitter women with too many herbs in their satchels, and a gaze that lingered too long. Then there were the wolves, real, teeth-baring wolves. They didn't care about your prayers. They only cared how deep the snow was, and whether you had shut the door tight enough. So every night was a ritual. The fire had to be banked just right. Not too bright to tempt the spirits, not too dim to let in the cold. Children were warned not to whistle after sunset. Women tucked sprigs of rosemary into their belts. Men whispered to the axe by the door, as if it might be called upon before morning. And then they waited. Beds creaked, someone coughed, a dog stirred in the yard. And in the space between each sound was that awful, aching silence. Even sleep wasn't safe. Dreams came hard and fast. They didn't ask permission. One night you were walking a golden field with your dead brother. The next, you were choking on ash, while unseen hands pulled you into a bog. No one called it trauma. They called it night pressing, or worse, the rider. If you woke up gasping, unable to move, sure that something was sitting on your chest, that was the rider. A demon, a spirit, a punishment, or maybe just your own mind trying to tell you that grief hadn't left. People didn't talk about those nights over breakfast. They stirred their porridge quietly, shook salt over their shoulder, avoided eye contact, because if you told your dream, it might come true. Or worse, you might learn someone else had the same one. Some fears were shared, the fear of losing a child in the night, of waking to silence in the cradle, of a fever that started at sundown and burned through till the rooster wept. There were no doctors, no calls to make, only herbs, hope, and the sound of your own heartbeat getting louder with every hour the illness lingered. But there were other fears too, ones you didn't speak, not because they were too big, but because they were too small. The fear that you'd wasted the day, that your wife had stopped singing when you entered the room, that the stew had tasted different tonight because there was less meat and more resignation. The fear that tomorrow's sunrise wouldn't feel like a blessing, but a sentence. Some men drank to outrun the dark, others prayed. A few just stared at the ceiling, watching shadows move and shift like memories that refused to settle. The church taught that fear was weakness, that faith was the torch that burned away doubt. But even the priest flinched when the bell rope creaked at midnight. Even he felt the weight of history pressing against the walls, whispering that sin didn't always wait for daylight. And maybe that was the truest fear, that God might not be watching, or worse, that he was, and still said nothing. Because the dark made you ask questions you didn't dare voice during the day. Like why some babies lived and others didn't. Why your neighbor's crop failed for the 3rd year straight despite all his fasting and tithing. Why your sister married a man with hands too quick and words too slow. The dark stripped away answers, left you with the raw wood underneath. And some people broke. They started hearing things, seeing things, sitting too long by the fire with eyes that never blinked, or walking into the woods alone without shoes or reason. And when they didn't return, people said it was the spirits, or the fae, or the punishment for not going to mass. But deep down, everyone knew. It was the weight of too many nights stacked on top of each other with no relief. And yet, they endured. Not always gracefully, not always whole. But they kept lighting fires, kept whispering charms, kept believing that maybe, just maybe, the dawn would come before the wolves. Some winters the night never seemed to end. Not in the sense of hours, but in the way it pressed into the corners of the soul and refused to leave. The sun would rise, yes. The frost would melt. The rooster would crow. But it felt performative, like the world was pretending it wasn't still haunted by what had happened while the fire burned low and the shutters rattled like bones. They said time heals, but they never said how long that took when time itself was warped by darkness. And some wounds didn't wait to be healed. They took root. A village might lose a child, a cough at dusk, a stillness by dawn, and that death would echo, not just in grief but in behavior. No one would use that cradle again. Even when another baby came, they'd build a new one, or bundle the infant close instead, just to be sure, just to distance themselves from the memory. But memory had sharp teeth. It didn't stay in one room. Soon, the door was being double locked. The salt line across the threshold thickened. People whispered longer before bed. Not prayers, but precautions. Don't dream too deep. Don't open the window. If the fire dies, let it. Don't feed it after midnight. Never call a name in the dark. It might answer. It didn't take long for superstition to become habit, and habit, in turn, became belief. They stopped walking the old road after dusk. Not because of wolves, but because that's where a man had once vanished. Just stepped into the mist and was never seen again. Maybe he left, maybe he got lost, or maybe something walked beside him that didn't want to share him. No one knew, and no one asked. Better to stay silent. Better to obey the rules that no one had written down but everyone knew. Because survival wasn't just about food or shelter. It was about respect. Respect for the dark, for what lived in it, for what it reminded you about yourself. And that was the hardest part. Not the monsters, not the spirits, but the reflection. Night was a mirror, and when the candles went out, you saw yourself too clearly. You saw the cruelty you wished away, the hunger you denied, the tiredness that turned you sharp, and the guilt you pressed flat beneath chores and duties. In daylight, it was easy to be kind, but at night, with no one watching, no labor to distract, your mind turned inward. And there you often found a stranger. That's why people huddled. Why entire families slept in the same room, sometimes the same bed. Not just for warmth, but for distraction. If you were listening to someone else breathe, you didn't have to think about your own. The smallest sounds were gifts. A fire crackling, a pot shifting, even a snore, because silence meant something had stopped. And too much silence, that could mean death. Even the animals played their part. Dogs barked at nothing, and people thanked them for it. Cats hissed at shadows, and no one scolded, because even false alarms reminded you that something was watching, and that was better than being alone. Some nights, nothing happened, no screams, no shadows, just cold and boredom, but those nights were never remembered. It was the ones with a single whisper, a sudden gust, a candle that refused to stay lit. Those were the nights people passed down. Tales were born not to entertain, but to survive. To explain what couldn't be explained, to give shape to the shapeless, to create boundaries where logic failed. So children were told of faceless women who waited at crossroads, of trees that bled, of a man who kept walking even after his head was gone, because he had no ears to hear he was dead. Were they real? Didn't matter. They were true, and in truth, there is power. Not the power to control the night, but to endure it. To understand that fear wasn't failure, it was preparation. It kept you alert, kept you humble, kept you alive. They didn't conquer the dark. They coexisted with it, like fire and smoke, like sorrow and song, like breath and the silence after. Even now, if you sit in an old house and turn off the lights, really off, you might feel it. The press of something ancient, something that remembers when the night was the master, and we were just visitors borrowing space until morning. You might hear the creak of floorboards where no one walks, the brush of air that moves with intention, the faintest sigh, not sad but knowing. Don't fear it, but don't ignore it either, because every time you notice it, you join a lineage older than empire, a lineage of people who feared the night and lit the fire anyway. 19. The longest winters. Some winters didn't end when the snow melted. They lingered. In coughs that wouldn't stop, in stores that stayed empty, in eyes that refused to meet yours over supper. Because in the Middle Ages, there were winters so long, so quiet, so unforgiving, that even the sky forgot how to be blue. You'd think cold was just a temperature, a number on a scale. But in those days, cold was a presence, a weight in your boots, a tension in your jaw, a question in your stomach every morning. Will the bread last? Will I? The calendar offered hope, a promise that April would come, that buds would bloom, that lambs would bleed again. But the longest winters broke that promise. Snow in May, frost in June, silence in July. They didn't call it climate change, they called it God's anger, or the devil's breath, or the price of sin, because when the cold refused to leave, faith trembled. And trembling made the cold feel deeper. You could measure it in practical ways, of course. Cabbages rotting in the ground before sprouting. Wolves descending from the hills, leaner than usual. Children born in spring dying before summer. A whole year's harvest reduced to 3 turnips and a prayer. But the cold didn't just kill crops. It eroded trust. Neighbors who once shared salt now clutched it tighter. The baker who used to stretch the loaves now locked his cellar. Even the church gave smaller blessings, whispers instead of sermons. Because even the priest was hungry. And hunger changes people. Not all at once, not with screams or violence, but slowly, like water wearing down a rock. It started with rationing. 1 less ladle of soup, half a candle instead of a whole. Then it moved to sacrifice. Let the youngest eat first. No need for 2 blankets. I'll sleep closer to the door. And finally, it reached surrender. People stopped asking questions, stopped making plans. There were no weddings that year, no births either. The midwife's hands stayed idle, folded in her lap like forgotten tools. And still the snow came. Not in blizzards, but in slow, aching flurries. A dusting every few days. Just enough to remind you that spring was a myth. The animals knew it too. Hens laid fewer eggs. Goats stood still, eyes glazed. Dogs no longer barked at the wind. They listened, as if waiting for something worse. Inside the cottages, time warped. There were no clocks. Only the sound of water dripping from the roof beams, the occasional snap of a log, and breathing. So much breathing. Raspy, shallow, uncertain. Children asked when it would be warm again. And their parents told them stories because they didn't know. Stories of summers with blueberries, of festivals where music played past sundown, of bees so fat they couldn't fly straight. And the children believed, because that's what children do. They hadn't lived through the last long winter. They didn't remember the year the river froze so deep that carts crossed it like a road, until it cracked and swallowed 3 of them whole. But the elders remembered. They remembered too much, and that memory sat heavy in their joints, curled beneath their fingernails, and echoed in the way they stirred their tea even when there was no sugar. Some tried to leave, packed what little they had, and set out toward places rumored to be warmer, fairer, less cursed. Most didn't make it. The roads were mud, the forests were cruel, and kindness was in short supply once the cold moved in. Others stayed, not out of hope, but out of habit. This was their land, their graveyard, their debt. So they dug deeper, into the snow, into their cupboards, into themselves. And strangely, in that desperation, something began to bloom. Not crops, not flowers, but resilience. A boy learned to snare rabbits with thread. A girl discovered how to boil bark into something like soup. An old man taught the village to melt ice from the well using coals buried in ash. Small victories, but they mattered. They reminded the people that they were not just victims of the cold. They were its adversaries. And sometimes they even laughed. Not often, not loudly, but enough. Enough to warm the corners of a dark room. Enough to make the candle feel brighter. Because in the longest winters, light wasn't measured in sunrises. It was measured in kindness. In the way someone split their last crust of bread, or held a baby they didn't birth, or sang an old hymn off-key just to drown out the sound of someone crying. They learned to find heat not just in fire, but in company, to sit close, to share breath, to believe that silence could be sacred instead of scary. They stitched extra padding into cloaks using hair from the floor. They lined their shoes with moss. They traded stories like they were currency, each one a memory worth more than gold. And when the first thaw came, it wasn't celebrated with trumpets, just a single drip from a roof onto a stone. So quiet, you'd miss it if you weren't listening. But they listened. Because in the longest winters you learn that hope has a sound, and it sounds like a single drop of water hitting frozen ground and refusing to freeze again. The thaw didn't arrive like a hero. It didn't burst through the sky with trumpets or chase the snow away in a blaze of heat. It tiptoed, soft, reluctant, as if afraid to be seen. It started with a trickle, not from the clouds, but from beneath the eaves. A single drop, then another, then hundreds, each one a whisper. You survived. But survival comes at a cost, because when the snow melts, it doesn't just uncover the ground. It uncovers everything you buried with it. The shoes left on the porch, still shaped to the feet that no longer wear them. The door left ajar because someone never came home. The spots at the table that no one dares to fill. Winter takes, but spring reminds you of what's missing. The roads reappear, but they don't lead where they used to. Bridges have collapsed. Paths have shifted. Even the sun seems unsure, casting a pale light like a guest who doesn't know whether they're welcome yet. And the people? They smile, they nod, they start to sweep. But underneath, beneath the wool and the soot and the new chores, they're grieving. Quietly, inwardly, because they made it. But not all of them did. And that's what the thaw reveals. Not just the bones of animals in the woods, or the broken fences, or the spoiled food at the back of the cellar, but the invisible lines drawn between befores and after. No one says it. There's too much to do. Fences to mend, fields to sow, children to distract. So they work. Work becomes the language of healing. Not because it cures, but because it occupies. Because you can't cry when your hands are busy with seeds. And soon things begin again. A girl finds a daffodil pushing through mud. A boy dares to chase a chicken across the yard. An old woman hums while patching her apron. And the tune is older than memory. Hope doesn't shout. It hums. It peaks. It reclaims. But there's guilt, too. Guilt for surviving. Guilt for smiling. Guilt for forgetting. Even for a moment. That someone else can't. They carry that guilt like an extra layer. Not visible, but always there. Like the ache in the bones from a healed break. You don't notice it every day, but it's part of you now. Still, the thaw softens things. It softens the soil so seeds can return. It softens the mood so laughter can slip back in, hesitant but welcome. It softens the stories too. The horror becomes humor, retold around fires with exaggerated voices. Remember when the goat got into the storeroom? Remember how we thought the wind was a witch? Remember how cold it was, and how close we sat? That closeness doesn't fade with the cold. If anything, it deepens, because once you've shared silence with someone, real silence, the kind with no promises, you never forget how to hear them. And so they begin again, not with certainty, not with plans, but with rhythm. The rhythm of planting, of patching, of waking before the sun and walking out into a world that might still betray you, but didn't today. Sometimes the thaw brings surprises. Tools thought lost are found under leaves. A necklace swallowed by mud is returned by roots. A seed dropped by accident grows wild in the wrong corner of the garden. And those surprises, they matter more than gold, because they're signs that the world still notices, still remembers, still wants to give in its own broken, quiet way. Some people leave after the thaw. Of brutal truths you'd learn if you survived just one winter in the Dark Ages. Hey friends, tonight, let's drift back in time. Farther than your grandmother's stories. Farther than electricity, engines, or even glass windows. We're going to visit a winter, but not just any winter. A winter that clung to your bones, crept into your dreams, and stayed for months without mercy. Outside, the wind isn't howling, it's breathing. Slow and steady, like something old and watching. Inside, the world is darker than you expect. Not pitch black, just tired. The candle's flame dances, but barely. Its light is warm, but not brave. The walls are made of timber, cracked and drafty. The roof is thatch, and the cold slips in quietly, like it belongs. You're lying on straw, worn, flattened, dusted with dirt and ash. Your blanket? Shared. With your brother, your sister, maybe even a goat. The fire's out, the wood is gone, and your breath rises like smoke, but disappears before it can finish its sentence. This was winter in the Middle Ages. Not the kind on postcards, not the kind with mugs of hot cocoa and freshly baked bread. This was the kind that made people disappear. Over the next 2 hours, we won't rush. We'll wander slowly, through the cold, through the quiet, through the forgotten lives of those who knew winter not as a season, but as a test. We'll meet them in their silence. We'll sit with them beside dying fires, and we'll listen, not for drama, but for truth. So if you're ready, pull your blanket a little tighter. Let your eyelids rest just a little heavier. And let me tell you what it felt like. To live through a winter you were never sure you'd see the end of. 1. The cold that hated you. It didn't start with snow. It started with stillness. A quiet that settled into the bones of the village. Long before the first flake touched the earth. Long before the sky turned heavy with that pale, silent gray. The animals knew first. They always did. The hens stopped laying. The dogs grew restless. The cows breathed slow and deep. And then, one morning, the air didn't move. Not a breeze. Not a bird. Just frost climbing the windowless walls. And silence so complete, it hummed. You didn't need a calendar. You felt it in your knuckles. In the way the wood split too easily. In the ache that settled in your jaw when you chewed cold bread. You woke up colder than you went to sleep. And every morning began with the same question. How bad will it be today? Because the cold didn't just arrive. It descended, like a second skin you couldn't peel off. Like a presence, unseen, but always there. It wasn't cruel with speed. It was cruel with patience. It waited for you to grow tired. It waited for your firewood to run out. It waited for you to stop pretending it would pass quickly. There were no coats, no puffer jackets, no synthetic linings. Just wool, scratched and mended, layered until it itched more than it warmed. Your boots weren't waterproof. They were barely shoes. Your feet went from numb to hurting to silent. That's when you knew the cold had won that round. The elders had stories, always stories. They said in the worst winters, the rivers didn't just freeze, they cracked. And if you listened closely at night, you could hear the sound of the frost splitting the earth like dry bones. Some said it was God's judgment. Others said it was the devil dancing in the trees. But most didn't say anything at all. They just huddled closer to the fire, closed their eyes, and hoped they'd open them again tomorrow. And yet, it wasn't the temperature that broke people. It was the sound it erased. No laughter, no song, no footsteps in the snow, because no one was walking. Just the creak of timber, and your own heartbeat echoing in your ears. You learned to fear that silence, because it meant everyone else was just trying not to die. And then, there was the cold that came from inside. From hunger, from grief, from knowing you couldn't help your child warm their hands, because yours were colder. That's the cold that hated you. Not just your body, but your hope. It didn't want to kill you fast. It wanted you to believe it never would. And then take you slowly, while you waited for a sun that never rose. And yet, some survived. They laughed even. Not because it was funny, but because there was nothing else to do. They beat the cold with songs made up on the spot, with dances by candlelight, with stories whispered in the dark. Stories like the one we're telling now. So, if you're still here, still listening, and still breathing warm air from your modern bed, let's keep going. Because cold was only the beginning. Next came the question of how to stay warm, in a world where warmth wasn't free. Coming up next, 2. How they tried and failed to stay warm. But for now, just breathe, and let the frost settle. We're not done yet. 2. How they tried and failed to stay warm. They tried. Of course they tried. You don't just lie down and let the cold take you. Not at first. Not when there's still a sliver of firewood, a scrap of wool, a bit of hope. They started with the hearth, the center of the home, the only source of heat. It wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, and most nights, it wasn't enough. They'd stack what they had. Twigs, straw, dried dung if they could find it. Whatever would burn without choking them to death with smoke. The fire didn't roar. It whimpered. It licked the stones, and flickered as if deciding whether to keep trying. They'd sit around it in silence. Children closest. Mothers behind them. Fathers at the edge. Animals just outside the ring, noses steaming in the cold air. Sometimes, they didn't speak for hours. They just listened to the crackle, like a heartbeat too faint to trust. When the firewood ran out, and it always did, they turned to the walls. Old beams, abandoned carts, even furniture passed down from grandfathers long dead. It was all just wood now, and survival doesn't care about sentiment. Next came the layering. Wool on wool. Shirts never washed because the dirt helped insulate. Scraps of leather, old curtains, even straw stuffed between tunics and skin. They wrapped their feet in rags, slept in hats, and pulled their sleeves down so far their fingers forgot how to move. But wool isn't magic. It slows the cold. It doesn't stop it. They shared body heat, not out of affection, out of necessity. Whole families slept in one bed, if they had one. If not, on the floor. Stacked like logs, arms around strangers, legs tangled with siblings. Even livestock were welcomed in, because the warmth of a goat was better than the pride of being clean. There were tricks. Some would heat stones in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and tuck them beneath blankets. Others slept with pots of warm water, until they cracked from the cold. Some chewed garlic, some drank vinegar, not for flavor, but because someone once said it helped. And in a world like that, any idea was worth trying. But the cold always found a way in, through gaps in the doorframe, through boots worn thin, through lungs that stopped steaming. And every night, someone somewhere asked the same quiet question. Is it always this hard? Some made it through by stubbornness, some by luck, and some didn't. A child fell asleep too far from the fire. A grandmother gave her blanket to the baby. A father stayed up to watch the embers, and never woke again. And still, they tried, because trying was all they had. No electric heat, no thermostat, no blanket delivery truck, just fingers, fire, and faith. Faith that tomorrow might be warmer. Faith that spring wasn't a lie. And when the fire burned out, they told stories in the dark. Stories of summers past, of sun-warmed stones and green fields, of apples so red they looked painted. They remembered warmth, because sometimes memory burns brighter than flame. And as the wind pressed harder against the walls, as frost crept in along the floorboards, they didn't fight it. They just pulled each other closer. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't beat the cold. You outlasted it. And not everyone did, but that was just one battle. Because even if you managed to stay warm, you still had to eat. And in winter, food wasn't just scarce. It was cruel. Beds were a luxury, sleep was survival. You didn't go to bed in the Middle Ages. You crawled toward rest, grateful, exhausted, and unsure if you'd wake again. Beds weren't things you owned. They were things you shared. And not just with family. With fleas, with mice, with the aching wood beneath you, and with the cold that never really left. Most didn't have a bed frame. The poor slept on the floor, on straw mostly. Sometimes mixed with old rags, leaves, or, if you were lucky, a wool blanket that hadn't been patched to death. It wasn't soft. It wasn't warm. But it was where you laid your body when the day stopped asking for it. And the day always asked for everything. There were no mattresses, no pillows fluffed with feathers, no privacy curtains tied with lace. Just corners. Dark corners. With people curled in them like folded laundry, stacked together like books no one finished reading. Sleep wasn't peaceful. It was an escape. A flicker of warmth stolen from the fire you could no longer feed. A window into dreams that were often warmer than the room you left behind. You didn't stretch. You curled. Tight, like a root in dry soil. And even then, sleep wasn't guaranteed. Not when the wind howled. Not when the roof dripped. Not when your child coughed through the night beside you. And certainly not when hunger made your stomach speak louder than your thoughts. There were nights when the cold was so sharp it felt like glass inside your chest. And you woke. Not because you were rested, but because your teeth were chattering too loud to ignore. They slept in shifts sometimes. One by the fire. One tending animals. One watching the door. Not out of fear of thieves, but because wild dogs followed the smell of death when the cold grew long. And yet even in this, there was tenderness. A mother brushing straw from her child's hair.